Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 382. This is the 4th anniversary episode, or not quite, because I think the first video went up on May the 1st, 2020, back in the depths of the pandemic, those early months of terror, fear, paranoia, some of it justifiable, and all the rest of it. And it began, of course, as my attempt to actually force myself to listen to a lot of the records I'd been acquiring, but had not necessarily listened to in any great depth. And the first one, as some of you will know, was on the topic of Led Zeppelin 3. If you want to see a video made by somebody who does not actually know how to make YouTube videos, who does so in an unscripted way, and is really actually not that comfortable speaking in front of a camera at all, then that's the video for you. Although it is notable, I think, that video, because it contains the story of how I actually got to drink water out of the well at Bronroar Cottage, which of course is the cottage where that record was written. To the extent that it's changed and the content has moved on and the quality has gotten a little bit better, it is partly or largely or almost exclusively due to engagement of viewers, subscribers, people like yourself. So I'm hugely grateful for that. This channel would quite literally be nothing without its subscribers. One of the things which has really kept me going on the channel has been all the engagement and feedback I've gotten from viewers, especially when people reach out and recommend great records that I haven't heard of but really should listen to. And so my whole goal of having this channel be a means of actually listening to all of the records which I have is now a complete pipe dream, because I've been acquiring records at a far faster rate than I've actually been reviewing them. So, you know, best laid plans. But the silver lining to all that is I really have felt like I've made a connection with a bigger community out there, people who share this really weird obsession which I have, so I don't quite feel so alone. Mrs. Reviews does her best to be supportive, but you know, there's only so far even a sterling person like herself is willing to go. I'm making this video for 3 reasons. First of all, to celebrate this 4th anniversary, which I think deserves a little bit of celebrating. Secondly, I wanted to let everybody know that I will be taking, as is kind of usual, a little break. For a while, I will not be making any videos in the month of May, so I will be back in June, loaded for bear. But the third reason is the most important reason, and it's that I want to enlist a little bit of assistance for the next video I'm making, and it has to do with a very important musical topic, and that musical topic is Duke Ellington. Now, I'll confess that Duke Ellington really intimidates me for a couple of reasons. First of all, he intimidates me just as a fan of music because his career was so long, it was so varied, it was so dynamic, it was so influential that really it's hard to know where to jump in and how to start. And I'll come back to that later because that's kind of the issue here. I'm also intimidated by him as somebody who affects to have opinions about jazz and to share those with other people, because he has for the longest time been a big gap in my knowledge. If you have been a regular follower of this channel for some time, you will have heard me at points say that I was not into big band music, that I was not interested in certain records because they had a big bandy kind of set of attributes and so on. And all that has been gnawing at me. And it's been gnawing at me because I am, of course, aware, and it is becoming more and more obvious with every single thing I learn about jazz, that Duke Ellington can never be irrelevant, regardless of what kind of jazz you're listening to, because he was amongst the very short list of people who can claim to have invented the jazz that we hear today. And what's more, the extent to which jazz then moved on in his later years, after World War II, for instance, from the kind of jazz that Duke and his peers had innovated, it was inevitably in reaction to Duke. So how can you understand the history of jazz without really understanding Duke Ellington and his music? And how can you understand what happened after World War II, when all of that great music emerges in the 1940s and 1950s, without understanding the context in which those people were making music and in which they grew up, which was very much the context of Basie, yes, Armstrong, yes, but perhaps above all, Duke Ellington. My own journey with Duke so far has been very tentative, I will say. I got into jazz because I dug 2 records my dad had. One was Getz Gilberto, which is a record I've reviewed, and it's just a fantastic record and is, of course, one of the great bossa nova records of all time. And the other was Dave Brubeck's Time Out. So for me, my comprehension of jazz started out with understanding jazz as small group stuff that happened in the post-war period, and from there my own knowledge has slowly, very gradually expanded through a series of concentric circles. In all of that, when I began to feel confident enough about what I knew to start talking about jazz with some degree of seriousness on the channel. I was always a little bit insecure about the big band era and my knowledge of it, which was pretty darn thin. What I did know, what gave me the confidence to make certain pronouncements, was that I was not wild about the big band era. In particular, I was not wild about the sound of massed brass sections, particularly doing high-pitched passages or very exuberant or kind of overwhelming passages with lots of high notes, kind of stuff that Maynard Ferguson does, or which just seemed to me kind of Vegasy and brassy and shouty and not very intimate and cool and interesting and fun. Now, people who are more experienced jazz listeners than me will recognize exactly what an ill-informed and kind of silly approach that was. It's not that those aspects of big band music aren't there, but there is so much more to the era before World War II, or before 1945, I should say, than just writing it all off as big band. And so it was with that thought in mind that I began recently to start to dig into Ellington's career. And I have to say, what I found has been completely fascinating, and it's also been kind of illuminating, because when I did dip into Ellington initially, because my bias was smaller groups and post-war jazz, I assumed that the Ellington that I would like the most would be the Ellington which was most like that. So the kinds of things that he did in the 1960s, in particular, when he was doing small group collaborations with people like Charles Mingus and John Coltrane and other folks like that. I was never that wild about those records. I've reviewed a couple of them. I think they're just okay. I never thought Duke's contributions were particularly great on those. And I kept wondering what all the fuss was about with Ellington, which again is a totally dumb and ahistorical question to ask, but nevertheless, that's what I was asking. One of the tricks, of course, when trying to learn about Ellington is that his career is so vast that it is a bit of a challenge to actually assemble something resembling a reasonable playlist. As with anybody who rose to musical prominence before about 1950, but particularly in the case of Ellington, who starts recording as soon as it's possible, effectively, to be recording popular music in and around 1924, almost all of his early career and his mid-career, arguably, was released not on LP-length albums, but on singles, and 78 RPM singles at that. So because so much of Duke's work is from that era, and because his catalog is so vast, learning about his career really involves consuming other people's curation of his catalog in the form of compilations. Incidentally, these are our chickens, and they share the level of knowledge about Duke Ellington which I had, say, probably 18 months ago. So I did some listening, I did some reading, I did some more listening, I did some more reading. Eventually, I started to dip into the compilation market, but it's very tricky because there are, again, so many different eras and so many people's different ideas of exactly what constitutes Duke's best work, even from particular eras. And because Duke would also do multiple versions of the same song, sometimes within the same year, what you're gathering from one compilation, which is, Duke's greatest whatever, is often, or in fact normally, fundamentally different from a similarly titled compilation. So the next video I do, which is going to come out in June when I'm back from my break, is going to deal with Duke Ellington. It is, I think, necessarily going to have to spend a bit of time on his life history, although I don't intend for this to be the sole focus of the video, nor to deal with that extensively, because there are lots of other places you can find Duke's life history, and you can find much better videos on that than I can produce. But I'll do enough of that to share for newbies, or people who are newbier than me, the key elements of his career and the key musical moments and the key collaborators that he had during those particular periods. And I will also be describing the compilations which I have found to be, I think, as good and as economical a survey of his massive career as one is likely to get, certainly up to 1945. And this is where you come in, because I'm hoping that amongst the viewers of this video are people who know a heck of a lot more about Ellington than I do, and or have spent some time acquiring a reasonable Ellington catalog, and will be willing in the interim to make some suggestions about different compilations and different versions of songs and different eras and so on, which would be fruitfully included in the information I provide in this video. We'll of course give due credit to everybody who helps out making this quixotic attempt to sketch out a Duke Ellington compilation acquisition plan a little less quixotic. This being Canada's west coast, it is now about to rain, or it is actually raining, in fact. So that brings this video to a close. Thanks very much for watching this last 4 years. A special shout out to those of you who have been with the channel all the way since those early Led Zeppelin days to where we are now. And thanks very much for watching. If you don't subscribe, please do subscribe. It is the lifeblood of the channel, and it makes me feel good every time somebody does that. It brings a little smile to my face. Hope you're enjoying the journey so far, and we'll see you next time.